On a storm-ripped night, a desperate scream pierced through the darkness, the moment when every lie collapsed. A betrayed daughter, a secret buried for years, and a chilling revenge ignited like wildfire. Blood tears and truth weave into a verdict for the traitors. This is not just a story, it's an unforgettable journey that grips your soul and refuses to let go. Before we begin, please subscribe to our channel to receive more dramatic and exciting episodes from us. The screen opens to white. Not the clean, soft kind of white, but a savage, devouring one. The kind that consumes shape, sound, and sense. Cedar Falls is buried under a storm that feels biblical wind howling like a chorus of ghosts. Snow driving sideways as if flung by unseen hands. The streets are empty lamps flickering with a sickly orange glow before being swallowed again in darkness. Cars sit abandoned under mounds of iced doors frozen shut. Every storefront has boards nailed across the glass. The entire town seems to be holding its breath, bracing for something that refuses to pass. Inside the town's hospital, the storm feels even heavier. The power is out across half the building. Emergency generators keep only a skeleton of light alive. Narrow corridors painted in cold fluorescent streaks, machines groaning like weary lungs. The waiting room, usually filled with restless chatter and tired sighs, is eerily silent. Chairs stand empty, and the vending machine hums like it is mocking the absence of life. In the distance, a faint thud echoes as a door bangs against its frame from the violence of the wind outside. Laura Bennett sits at the nurse's station, shoulders hunched against the dim glow of a desk lamp. She is 27, her hair tied in a messy bun, her scrubs layered under a fleece jacket. The night has dragged on like an endless corridor, and she has been alone for hours. The storm had forced half the staff to abandon their posts and drive home before the roads closed, but Laura stayed. Duty, or maybe stubbornness, kept her rooted here. She clicks through patient files on an old laptop whose battery is limping toward death. Each click echoes too loudly in the silence, like she is breaking something fragile. She glances up at the windows where snow smears against the glass, thick and merciless. The world beyond is invisible, reduced to a shifting blur of white. She whispers to herself, a little mantra, something to fight the stillness. Just get through the night. Her voice is barely audible over the hiss of the heater that sputters every few minutes. Then a sound cuts through. At first, she thinks it is the storm itself reshaping its howl into something else. But no, it is sharper, more deliberate, a pounding urgent echoing through the front entrance of the hospital. And beneath it, a dog's bark, rough, insistent, desperate. Laura freezes. The hospital has been dead quiet for hours, and the sound crashes into her like a stone into water. She pushes back her chair, the wheels squeaking against the linoleum, and listens. 3 pounding knocks, spaced with the precision of panic. Then silence. Then the bark again, closer this time. She hesitates. Protocol whispers in her head, "Don't open the doors during lockdown." The storm makes everything dangerous, strangers especially. But there is something in that sound, not just urgency, but fear. Laura rises, her legs stiff from hours of stillness. She makes her way down the corridor, each step echoing with a weight that feels magnified in the empty building. The doors at the front lobby tremble against the storm's assault. Snow presses up against the glass in uneven heaps, and through the blur of white she can barely make out a figure. Then another. And the dark shape of a dog, its body pressed against the frame, tail-rigid ears perked. Laura's heart pounds. She grips the handle of the heavy door, but pauses, her breath clouding in the frigid air seeping through the gaps. The figure outside slams the glass with a fist, the outline staggering unsteady. She sees the smear of blood against the window. She makes her choice. She unlocks the door. The storm roars in, immediately ripping at her clothes, filling her lungs with icy knives. She braces herself against the wind as the figures stumble in, a man tall but collapsing under his own weight, one arm wrapped around a small boy, the other dragging a heavy duffel bag. The dog pushes through behind them, fur matted with snow, and streaks of red, its breath steaming in rapid bursts. The man crashes to his knees just past the doorway, clutching his son to his chest. His face is pale, almost gray, with streaks of blood trailing from his temple. His lips are cracked and blue. The boy Ethan, though Laura does not know his name yet, is shaking violently, his teeth chattering so hard they sound like breaking glass. His eyes are wide, glassy, as if he is halfway between here and somewhere far away. Laura slams the door shut, wrestling it back into place, until the latch clicks, shutting out the storm again. The sudden silence afterward is deafening. She drops to her knees beside them. Hey, can you hear me?" Her voice is sharp, commanding the kind of tone she has practiced in emergencies. The man lifts his head barely. His eyes are striking green, clouded with pain, but fiercely alive. He tries to speak, but it comes out a rasp. "Please, help him." He pushes the boy into Laura's arms, collapsing forward in the same motion. Laura catches Ethan wrapping her arms around him, feeling the violent tremors of his body. His skin is like ice beneath his damp clothes. She snaps into motion. She pulls him tight against her, whispering, you're okay, even though she doesn't know if it's true. The dog presses against Ethan's side, whining as though urging her to move faster. Laura looks at the man again, Daniel, though his name is still a mystery to her, and sees the spreading crimson stain across his shirt, dark against the pale fabric. She knows a bullet wound when she sees one. She fights down the rising panic clawing at her chest. She is alone. No doctors, no backup, no one else to call. It is just her. Laura gets to her feet, hauling Ethan up with surprising strength. "We have to move," she mutters, half to herself, half to the boy whose head lolls against her shoulder. She looks back at the man. "Stay with me, don't you pass out." She rushes them down the corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects. The storm rattles the windows, pounding against the hospital like a predator trying to get in. Her mind races. Who are they? Why were they out there? What happened to him? But the questions have to wait. Right now, survival comes first. She bursts into an exam room, flicks on the emergency lamp, and lowers Ethan onto the gurney. The dog leaps up, standing guard beside him, its chest heaving, eyes locked on the door as if expecting another threat to crash in at any moment. Laura runs back into the corridor to drag the man. He is heavier than she expects, his body limp with exhaustion. But she grips under his arms and pulls with every ounce of strength. Her breath comes ragged, her muscles screaming, but inch by inch, she gets him into the room. She drops him onto the second bed with a grunt, her arms trembling from the effort. For a second, the room is filled only with the sound of breathing, hers rapid and sharp. Ethan's shallow and uneven. The man's ragged with pain, and the dog's steady but alert. Laura presses her palms against the man's wound, blood seeping hot against her hands. She looks into his eyes again. "You can't pass out on me, do you understand?" "Not tonight." His gaze locks on hers, something unspoken flickering there, trust or maybe desperation. His lips move, forming words she barely catches. "Don't let them take him." Them. Laura stiffens, her mind spinning. This is no random accident. No lost traveler. There is something far darker beneath the surface of this storm. But before she can ask, Ethan stirs, a soft whimper breaking from his lips. His small hand clutches the dog's fur knuckles white. The animal lowers its head beside him, a silent guardian. Laura sees it then, the connection raw and unbreakable between boy and dog. And something in her chest tightens. She looks from Ethan to the man, and then at the storm battering the windows. Whatever they have brought with them, it has teeth. And it is coming. But tonight, they are here, with her, and she is not going to let them be swallowed. The clock ticks. 7 minutes into the story, and the storm has already carried its secrets inside. The exam room smells of metal, antiseptic, and blood. The emergency lamp flickers overhead, a weak circle of light that seems too fragile to hold back the darkness pressing against the walls. Laura's hands are slick with crimson as she works her gloves, already soaked through, pressing gauze into Daniel's wound with desperate precision. His breathing is shallow, uneven, rattling like stones caught in a tide. Her focus should be on the injury, on stopping the bleeding. But her eyes keep darting to his face. Not just because of the way his skin has drained of color, but because of his eyes. They are not glassy with pain, not lost in the fog of unconsciousness. They are alive. Sharp, tracking every corner of the room like a soldier scanning a battlefield. Laura feels it before she even processes it. The tension in his body is not only from pain, it's vigilance. He is listening, watching, bracing. His muscles twitch when a pipe groans somewhere down the hall. His jaw tightens when the storm hurls a sheet of snow against the windows. And then he does something that roots her to the spot. His gaze flicks to the corners of the ceiling, the vents, the door, and finally the window. Not as if he's delirious, as if he knows, as if he's being hunted. Laura tries to shake it off. She forces her hands steady, presses harder on the wound, whispers to herself. Keep pressure slow, the bleeding one step at a time. She wants to drown in routine and clinical distance, but Daniel snaps her out of it. His hand shoots up, clamping weakly around her wrist. His grip is trembling, but urgent. His voice is raw, cracked by the storm and blood loss, but it slices through the silence like a blade. "They're coming," he whispers. Laura freezes. The words hang between them, heavy, impossible to ignore. She searches his face. "What do you mean?" Daniel swallows the effort visible in the tendons of his neck. His chest rises and falls too quickly, but his eyes burn with a clarity that is almost unbearable. "If I don't make it, you protect my boy." His voice is shredded, but the intent is unshakable. "Don't let them take him." For a moment, Laura forgets to breathe. She glances at Ethan. The boy hasn't let go of Rex, the German shepherd, whose fur is still damp with melted snow. Ethan's little fingers clutch the animal's coat as if it's the only anchor keeping him from drifting into the storm outside. His eyes are wide, unblinking, glassy with fear. He doesn't understand every word, but he understands enough. His father's voice, the weight of the command, the presence of danger. Laura's chest tightens. This is no accident. Not a family caught in a storm. Something much darker has dragged them here. Ethan's trembling worsens. Rex presses closer, a steady wall of warmth and muscle, his amber eyes flicking from Laura to Daniel and then to the door. The dog senses the tension, ears pricked, a low whine curling from its throat. Laura forces herself to push down the rising panic. She leans closer to Daniel, whispering through gritted teeth. "Who's coming? What are you running from?" Daniel's lips part, but the sound that emerges is closer to a groan than an answer. He squeezes her wrist one last time before his hand slips back to the gurney, drained of strength. His chest still rises, but the edges of consciousness are pulling at him. He is vanishing into the dark. "Stay with me." Laura urges her hands, returning to the wound, but her mind is a storm of its own. His words echo in her skull. "They're coming. Protect my boy." The room feels smaller, as if the walls are closing in. She glances at the door, then at the window, half expecting shadows to be waiting just beyond the glass. The storm howls louder, rattling the panes like skeletal fingers, and then a sound, subtle but sharp, not from inside, from outside. Laura stiffens. She crosses the room to the narrow strip of window. She wipes away condensation with her sleeve, leaning close to peer through the snow-caked glass. The storm is still fierce, but between gusts, she catches it, headlights cutting briefly through the blizzard. Too steady to belong to a stranded driver. Too deliberate to be chance. She squints, heart pounding. A dark vehicle sits idling just beyond the edge of the hospital's lot, half buried in drifting snow. The engine hum is faint but real, a low growl carried by the wind. Its lights blink once, then vanish as though someone deliberately killed them. Her breath fogs against the glass. A cold realization trickles down her spine. Whoever is in that vehicle isn't looking for shelter. They're waiting, watching. Laura steps back, pulse hammering in her throat. Behind her, Ethan shifts restlessly on the gurney, clutching Rex tighter. The boy has seen it in her face. He knows she's afraid, even if she doesn't speak it. His small voice breaks the silence. "They found us, didn't they?" The words pierce her. He knows. This boy has been living inside the shadow of pursuit for longer than tonight. Laura crouches beside him, forcing her voice steady. "You're safe here. Do you understand me? You're safe as long as I'm here." But even as she says it, her eyes flick to the window again. She isn't sure. Not anymore. Rex lets out a sharp bark, startling in the small room. He leaps from the gurney to the floor, body-rigid ears pricked toward the hallway. His growl is low guttural, vibrating the linoleum beneath Laura's shoes. Laura follows his gaze. The hallway is empty, only the hum of failing lights and the echo of the storm outside. Yet the air feels different now, heavier electric, charged with the sense that the night itself has shifted. Daniel stirs his voice, rasping from the gurney. Lock the doors. Laura jolts, realizing too late how exposed they are. She races to the exam room door, slams it shut, twists the lock until it clicks. The sound is thin against the storm, but it is all she has. She leans against the door chest, heaving, listening. For a long, unbearable moment, there is nothing but silence and the faint moan of the wind. Then, faintly carried by the storm, another sound creeps in. A car door slamming shut. Then another. Her eyes widen. She doesn't need to see them to know the darkness outside has taken shape. Whoever was in that vehicle has stepped into the snow, and they're coming closer. Laura presses her forehead to the door, eyes closed, every nerve alive with fear. She whispers to herself, barely audible, God, help us. The clock ticks. 7 minutes have stretched into eternity, and yet the night is only just beginning. The storm outside howls like a living thing, rattling the hospital's hollow bones. The fluorescent light above flickers once more, as though it too is trembling under the weight of the truth, pressing to be spoken. Laura stands rooted to the spot, her hands still smeared with Daniel's blood. The words he had whispered moments before, protect my boy, echo in her ears, but now his lips part again, and what spills out is something heavier, darker, a confession that changes everything. Daniel's chest rises with a ragged breath. His voice is low, rasping, but his eyes lock on hers, with the intensity of a man who knows his time to speak is running out. I wasn't just running, he begins, and the sound of his voice forces Laura to step closer, as if drawn to gravity itself. I used to wear the badge, FBI. The air seems to leave the room. Laura blinks at him, her mind scrambling. FBI. Not a drifter, not some father caught in a random storm, an agent, or at least once an agent. Daniel swallows, grimacing as pain lances through him, but he doesn't stop. His words are clipped heavy with urgency. 3 months ago, I took something. A hard drive. Evidence, proof of something no one wanted to believe. Laura's heart stutters. Evidence of what? His eyes close for a fleeting moment, as though the very memory poisons him. When they open again, his gaze is sharp, haunted. A network. International. Trafficking children. Buying, selling, moving them across borders like cattle. His jaw clenches, rage flickering even in his broken state. And the man behind it, Malcolm Ward. Untouchable. Rich. Connected to everyone that matters. The name means nothing to Laura at first, but the way Daniel spits it makes her feel it should. Malcolm Ward. The syllables coil in the pit of her stomach like venom. Daniel's hand twitches against the sheets, his knuckles whitening, as if he wants to crush the name itself. They've built a kingdom of shadows. Politicians, businessmen, cops, all on the payroll. No one would listen, no one dared to dig deeper. So I stole the only thing that could bury them. A drive filled with names, dates, shipments, all of it. Laura's breath catches. Her mind reels at the scale of what he's describing. This isn't just crime. This is rot at the core of everything she thought was untouchable. But then Daniel's voice cracks, his gaze sliding toward the boy sitting only feet away. Ethan's small frame is curled against Rex, the dog pressing into him with protective weight. The child is silent, his eyes too wide, too, knowing for someone so young. Daniel's throat tightens. Ward found out. He always finds out. And he didn't come for the drive, not at first. He swallows, hard tears welling against his will. He came for my son. Laura's chest clenches, a surge of nausea climbing into her throat. Ethan, she whispers. Daniel nods, each movement costing him strength he doesn't have. He's the ransom, the leash around my neck. Ward thinks if he owns my boy, he owns me. He thinks I'll hand over everything Bo to him, erase the proof. He doesn't understand. His breath hitches. His eyes flicker with fire even as his body fails him. He doesn't understand. I'd burn the world before I let him touch my son. Silence hangs heavy, thicker than the storm outside. Laura feels her hands trembling, though she presses them flat against the gurney to hide it. A part of her wishes she could unhear his words, that the nightmare he describes is a fever dream. But the sincerity in his voice, the raw terror etched into Ethan's face, it makes denial impossible. 1,000 questions claw at her throat. Why here? Why now? Why bring this storm into her hospital? But the one that escapes her lips is the one she cannot suppress. Why me? Why drag this to my door? Daniel turns his gaze to her, and there is no cruelty in it, no manipulation, only desperation. Because I had no one else. Everyone I knew was compromised, bought, or already dead. You were chance, a light in the snow. And maybe... His breath falters, but he fights through it. Maybe chance is all that's left to believe in. Laura feels her pulse in her ears hammering so hard, she thinks the sound alone might give them away. The weight of what he's revealed presses against her chest, making it hard to draw breath. She wants to tell him she can't. She's not built for this, not a soldier, not an FBI agent. She's a doctor, a woman who signed up to save lives, not to hold the world's ugliest secrets. But then her eyes fall on Ethan again. The boy is clinging to Rex, whispering into the dog's ear as if the animal is the only thing that keeps him tethered. His lips move soundless, but Laura knows what he's saying. Please don't let them take me. Please don't let them win. Her heart cracks. Before she can speak, the silence fractures. A sound cuts through the storm, distant at first, but growing. A shrill mechanical wail, splitting the night into shards. The hospital alarm. Laura whirls toward the hallway, her stomach dropping. The sound is coming from deep within the building, echoing off tile and concrete, rising above the storm. It is not the fire alarm, not a warning of smoke. This is different. This is a signal. Daniel's eyes snap open wider, panic flaring. They've breached. They tripped the system. Laura's blood turns cold. Somewhere in the dark corridors of the hospital, the intruders are moving. The storm was their cover, but now they are beside the walls. Ethan flinches at the sound, clamping his hands over his ears. Rex pressing closer with a low growl. Laura's chest heaves as adrenaline floods her veins. The fragile calm that held them together is shattered. Now, there is only survival. She looks back at Daniel, at the man who moments ago confessed to carrying the world's dirtiest secret in his bloodied hands. He meets her gaze, and for a fleeting second, there is no FBI, no stolen drive, no empire of shadows. There is only a father begging for his son's life. Laura nods almost imperceptibly, but the promise is there. She will protect Ethan. The alarm blares on, shrieking through the corridors. And the storm outside, for the first time, no longer feels like the greatest threat. The alarm still echoes in Laura's ears as she pushes open the rear doors of the hospital, the storm swallowing them whole. Snow lashes her face like shards of glass, the wind a furious hand trying to shove them back inside, back into danger. But there's no going back. Not now. Daniel had insisted on staying behind, forcing the door closed with the last of his strength, giving them precious seconds to escape. His voice is still alive in Laura's head. Protect him, whatever it takes. The weight of that plea presses down on her with every staggering step into the storm. Ethan clings to her side, his small body trembling beneath layers of soaked fabric. Rex stays close for her, bristling his head, snapping side to side as if every shifting shadow hides teeth. The hospital fades into the blur of white, swallowed by the blizzard. Ahead, the land rises into a slope thick with pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. Laura doesn't know where she's leading them, only that forward is the only option. Each gust of wind robs her of air, steals her bearings. Then through the swirl of white, she sees it, a jagged silhouette against the slope. A structure barely visible, but real. A cabin. Her legs surge with desperate strength. This way, she shouts over the roar of the wind, pulling Ethan toward it. The cabin crouches on the hillside like a relic left behind by time. Its roof sagging beneath decades of snow. The wooden walls blackened and split by storms long past. A crooked chimney juts skyward, exhaling no smoke, lifeless, abandoned. They stumble onto the porch, the boards groaning beneath their weight. Laura fumbles with the door, her numb hand slipping against the rusted handle before Rex barrels forward, his weight slamming it open. The air inside is stale, laced with the sour tang of mold and dust. Darkness presses against them, broken only by the faint spill of snow-filtered moonlight through cracked shutters. The storm howls through the broken seams of the walls, a constant reminder they are never truly safe. Laura ushers Ethan inside, pulling the door shut with a heavy thud. She kneels in front of him, her hands gripping his shoulders. His face's pale lips, blue-tinged eyes wide with fear. "We're safe for now," she tells him, her voice steady, though her chest is on fire with doubt. "Do you hear me, Ethan? You're safe." He nods faintly, but the tremor in his jaw betrays him. Rex presses against him, anchoring him with the solid warmth of his body. Laura lets her gaze sweep the room. The cabin's interior is skeletal, a single room with a half-collapsed loft above furniture left to rot. A table slants with a broken leg. Chairs lie on their sides, their wood gnawed by insects. In one corner, the husk of a fireplace yawns cold and empty. Wind slips through the gaps in the window frames, whistling a mournful tune that makes the place feel haunted. She pulls Ethan closer to the hearth, brushing away debris, and finds a few splintered logs stacked beside it. Her hands are clumsy, but she manages to coax a flame to life, the firelight flickering weakly before swelling. The glow chases the shadows back, painting the room in trembling gold. Ethan watches the flames, his breathing slowing. But Laura sees how his fists still clench around Rex's fur, holding on as if letting go means losing everything. She knows the boy is on the brink, terror, grief, exhaustion. He needs more than warmth. He needs something to tether him to hope. Laura draws in a slow breath. Then she leans closer, her voice soft like one might use to soothe a child to sleep. "When I was your age," she begins, "my mother used to tell me stories on nights when storms like this rattled the windows. She'd say storms are only loud because they're trying to scare us. But they're just noise. They can't touch us if we stay together." Ethan's eyes lift, uncertain, searching her face. "She told me a story about a girl who was braver than she ever believed she could be. A girl who thought she was small, invisible. Until one day, she stood up to something much bigger than her. And she learned that courage isn't about not being afraid." Laura's throat tightens, but she pushes through. "It's about being afraid and choosing to protect the people who matter anyway." Ethan blinks at her, his lips parting. For a heartbeat, the fear in his eyes softens, replaced by a flicker of something else, the fragile beginnings of trust. Is that what you're doing?" His voice is a whisper. Laura smiles faintly, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "That's what we're doing, together." He nods almost imperceptibly and leans into Rex, who exhales a low huff as though in agreement. The fire crackles, filling the silence, wrapping them in a fragile cocoon of warmth. But then Rex stiffens. The shift is immediate, electric. His ears prick, his muscles coil, and a low growl vibrates deep in his chest. His eyes lock on the doorway. Laura freezes, her pulse spiking. She knows that sound. The dog isn't restless. He's warning. Slowly, carefully, she rises to her feet. The storm outside masks everything. But now that she's listening, she hears it too. Something beyond the wind, faint, deliberate. A crunch of snow. A pause. Another. Footsteps. Someone is circling the cabin. Laura's throat dries. She steps closer to the door, her hand pressing against the rough wood as though it could tell her what waits beyond. Shadows flicker through the cracks, fleeting unformed. She turns to Ethan, who is clutching Rex tighter. His eyes wide again, panic clawing back to the surface. "Stay here," she whispers, raising a finger to her lips. Ethan shakes his head violently, fear bursting free. But she steadies him with her gaze firm, unwavering. "I need you to be brave, Ethan. Just for a little longer. Can you do that for me?" His lip trembles, but he nods. The footsteps continue slow circling. Whoever it is isn't rushing. They're hunting, watching, waiting for fear to eat them alive before striking. Rex snarls, the sound filling the cabin like a blade unsheathed. Laura presses her back to the wall beside the door, her breath shallow. She feels the vibration of each step reverberate through the wood. Whoever is out there, they know. They know the cabin isn't empty. Her mind races. She has no weapon, no plan. Only instinct and the determination not to let Ethan fall into those hands. The fire sputters behind her, throwing shadows across the cabin walls. The storm screams outside. And just beyond the door, the predator waits. The cabin walls seem to breathe with the storm. The wind clawed at the cracks, carrying whispers that might have been nothing more than the blizzard's voice, but Laura knew better. She felt the pressure, the deliberate cadence of something human lurking beyond the storm's veil. Rex's growl deepened, vibrating through the floorboards. He was locked on the door. His teeth bared, his entire body a coiled spring. Then it appeared. At first, Laura thought the storm had tricked her eyes. But as the snow swirled, the unmistakable shape began to take form on the weathered wood of the door. Crimson, stark against the pale frost. A symbol smeared in thick strokes of blood, uneven, jagged, deliberate. Her breath hitched. It wasn't just a warning. It was a mark, a claim. Ethan saw it too. His small gasp was sharp, fragile like glass breaking. He clutched at her arm, his voice trembling. "What? What is that?" Laura's throat felt strangled, but she forced steadiness into her words. "Don't look at it, sweetheart. Stay close to me." Before she could say more, the storm's howl fractured with the crackle of static. Then a voice, amplified metallic, filled the night. Inside the cabin it drawled, cold, unhurried. "We know you can hear us. We know what you carry. Hand over the boy and this ends. Refuse, and the snow will bury you all." The sound wasn't just outside. It pressed against the cabin walls, vibrating through the wood, crawling under her skin. The deliberate calm in the voice was worse than any shouted threat. Ethan flinched, as though the words themselves had weight pressing him into the ground. Laura wrapped her arms around him, shielding him from a terror no embrace could block. Rex barked a fierce, echoing sound that bit into the silence, but even his defiance could not erase the pounding dread. The voice returned louder now. "We don't want her. We don't want the dog. Just the boy. Give him to us and walk away. No one has to suffer." Laura pressed her eyes shut, fury surging in her chest. She could almost feel Daniel's voice again, echoing in memory. "Protect him. Whatever it takes." She whispered it under her breath, a vow. They don't get him. Ever. But the storm was not done. The sound of crunching footsteps drew closer, slow and deliberate. Then came the knock. Not on the door. Not gentle. It rattled the boards, sharp and official like the knock of authority. A second knock followed, then a third, rhythmic, and then voices. "Ma'am, open up. This is the state police. We've been tracking fugitives through the storm." Another voice chimed in, urgent but practiced. "Please, for your safety, let us in." Laura froze. Her mind raced, torn between instinct and desperation. Could it be true? Could rescue have come this quickly? The uniforms, the knock, the tone, it all sounded right. Her hand drifted toward the door. Rex lunged between her and the wood, snarling so violently his saliva sprayed against the boards. His body blocked her path, his eyes flashing with a warning more powerful than words. Laura's heart hammered. She looked again at the blood symbol smeared across the door. If those men outside truly were police, would they mark the cabin with such grotesque signs? She hesitated. "How do I know you're real?" She called out, her voice breaking the cabin's fragile silence. The answer came too quickly, too smooth. "Open up and you'll see. We can protect you." The words scraped across her nerves. It was the wrong answer. The real police would demand identification, would give protocol, would not need to persuade. Her stomach turned to ice. "They're lying," she whispered, more to herself than to Ethan. Rex's bark exploded again, fierce, unrelenting, as though to punctuate the truth. The pounding on the door intensified, fists slamming against the wood. The false voices rose, slipping between tones of authority and menace. "Ma'am, open this door. You're endangering the child. Don't make us force our way in." Each demand twisted tighter around Laura's mind, squeezing. The cabin seemed smaller, the air thinner, the shadows sharper. The storm outside was no longer the enemy. It was the suffocating stage on which this cruel game played out. Ethan clutched at her sleeve, his voice a trembling reed. "Laura, what if they're telling the truth?" Her chest caved. She wanted to promise certainty to shield him from even the question. But there was no certainty, only the heavy truth of her instincts, screaming at her not to trust. She knelt in front of him, taking his face in her cold hands. "Listen to me, Ethan. There are people out there who will say anything, be anything to get what they want. But you cannot listen to them. Do you understand? You can only listen to me." His eyes brimmed with tears, but he nodded, his small chin trembling against her palms. The pounding ceased. The silence that followed was worse. For a moment, Laura dared to hope they had given up. But then came the voice again, lower, now almost intimate, slipping through the cracks like smoke. Laura. Her blood ran cold. They knew her name. The voice lingered, savoring it. You can't protect him forever. You're not strong enough, not clever enough. You've already failed once tonight. Why let the boy suffer for your stubbornness? Her knees buckled. She staggered back against the wall, breath ragged. The words pierced her armor, striking at wounds still raw from Daniel's sacrifice. Ethan buried his face in Rex's fur, sobbing. The dog stayed rigid, growling like a thundercloud about to split. Laura pressed her hands to her head, fighting to block out the words. Don't let them in. Don't let them win. But the pressure was mounting unbearable. The storm outside had become their ally, howling, masking, twisting every sound into menace. Her own thoughts betrayed her whispering possibilities. What if she was wrong? What if they really were police, the only chance for survival, and she was dooming Ethan by refusing? Her chest constricted, the edges of panic blurring her vision. Hold on. She forced herself to the fire, staring into the flames. The crackle, the light had anchored her, a reminder she was still in control. She turned back to Ethan, kneeling again. Look at me, she urged, gripping his shoulders. We're not opening that door. Not for anyone. Do you hear me? They're playing games trying to scare us. But we're stronger than their tricks. We survive by holding on to each other. That's how we win. Ethan sniffled, his tears streaking pale lines through the soot on his face. Slowly, shakily, he nodded. Laura drew him into her arms, holding him against her chest. She could feel his heart hammering wild as her own. Rex circled the door, his growl never wavering. Outside, the voices faded, swallowed again by the storm. But Laura knew this wasn't retreat. It was escalation. The game had begun. And in the silence, the blood symbol on the door seemed to pulse like a wound, a reminder of the predators who waited for the next move. Laura tightened her grip on Ethan and whispered into his hair, not for reassurance, but as an unbreakable vow. They don't get you. Not tonight. Not ever. And in that vow, even as fear gnawed at her bones, a spark of defiance ignited a fragile fire she would keep alive against the storm and the lies pressing in from the dark. The storm had quieted only slightly, but the cabin's atmosphere remained suffocating. Laura's nerves were still frayed from the psychological assault outside her pulse, refusing to slow. She had barely steadied Ethan when the faintest crackle drifted through the room, an intrusive, unnatural sound that didn't belong to firewood or wind. It came from the old shortwave radio on the shelf. Laura blinked. She hadn't even noticed the radio before dust covered, battered, the kind of relic left behind by hunters who once claimed the cabin. Yet now its static whispered like a restless ghost. Ethan's ears caught it first. He straightened from Rex's fur, his small face lifting with cautious curiosity. Laura, do you hear that? The sound thickened, evolving from random static into faint rhythm. Bursts of noise, gaps. A stutter, then silence, then another deliberate sequence. Laura's stomach tightened. This wasn't random interference. It was a signal. Ethan stepped closer, his little hands hovering above the knobs. He hesitated, then twisted one. The static sharpened into a jagged thread of noise before aligning into something more. A voice, distant, distorted, but undeniable. Male, calm, low, speaking in clipped fragments as though each word mattered. Delta, 7, North Ridge, initiate. The rest collapsed back into static. Ethan's eyes widened. It's talking. Laura pressed a hand to his shoulder. Step back, honey. Let me. But Rex growled suddenly. Not at the door, not at the storm, but at the radio itself. He lowered his head, ears pricked, his body rigid with focus. He moved closer, nose flaring as though he could smell the voice through the wires. Then astonishingly, he barked once, short, sharp, precise, and turned his head toward the northern wall of the cabin. Laura stared. It wasn't random. It was directional, as if the dog understood where the voice had originated. Rex, what is it? She whispered. The radio crackled again, another fragment slipping through. Ward, hold position, shadow cover, extraction. Ethan's lips parted. He repeated the words slowly, his child's voice trembling. Ward, hold, position. The name struck Laura like a bolt. Ward. She had heard it before whispered on Daniel's lips when he thought she wasn't listening. A faction, a splinter, a group hidden beneath layers of secrecy. Before she could question further, the cabin door burst with the sound of a heavy impact. Not a breach yet, but enough to rattle the wood. Laura and Ethan froze. Rex snarled, and then through the chaos, a new sound. Footsteps faint but recognizable pacing outside, followed by that same metallic broadcast voice booming through the storm. Time is running out, Laura. You can't hide him forever. Decide before we decide for you. Her stomach flipped, but this time she didn't collapse under the weight. She had something new, a thread, a clue. She dragged Ethan back from the door, whispering fiercely. Stay with me. Don't look at them. Don't listen. But Ethan wasn't entirely with her. His eyes were fixed on the radio, his small hands trembling as though he felt something beyond the static. He whispered almost to himself, It's not just noise. It's a map. A code. Laura frowned. What do you mean, a code? He glanced at her eyes, wide frightened yet certain. I can hear patterns. Like when Dad used to tap messages on the table. Laura's heart seized. Daniel! Before she could answer, another surge of words bled through the static, fragmented, but clear enough. Ciao. Link. Secure. Ethan gasped, pressing closer to the radio. They're talking about me. Laura pulled him back instantly, shielding him as though the voice itself could reach through the airwaves. No. Don't listen. Don't let them inside your head. But Rex barked again this time, circling the room, then stopping facing Ethan. His eyes were intense, sharp as though he was urging the boy to understand. Ethan knelt, placing a shaky hand on Rex's fur. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, he pressed his forehead lightly against the boy's. Laura's breath caught. It was more than comfort. It was communication. Ethan's lips parted. He knows where it's coming from. He knows the voice. Laura shook her head, desperate to hold on to logic. Sweetheart, it's just no. Ethan cut her off, his tone startling in its certainty. He's showing me, Laura faltered. She wanted to deny it, to shut down what sounded impossible. But the intensity in Ethan's eyes, the focus in Rex's posture, it wasn't a child's fantasy. It was real. The radio flared again, louder this time, almost urgent. Ward, Code 7, protect the asset. Laura stiffened. The asset. Cold terminology for something or someone they valued. Ethan's small voice quivered. That's me, isn't it? Her chest broke. She wanted to lie to shield him, but the boy's gaze demanded truth. Yes, she whispered, her voice raw. But you are not an asset. You are not theirs. You are my responsibility, my family. Do you hear me? That's all you are. Ethan swallowed, tears welling. But why me? Before she could answer, another presence entered the silence. A voice Laura had only ever heard in memory. Daniel's voice, steady, firm, pragmatic. Not alive, not here, but imprinted in the way Ethan repeated fragments he remembered. Dad said, Ward has enemies. He said they'd use anything to win. Even me. Laura's chest constricted. The boy's memory was pulling truths she'd never dared to confirm. She pressed her forehead to his, grounding him. Listen to me. You are not theirs. You belong here. To us. To yourself. They don't decide who you are. We do. Together. The boy trembled, but in his eyes flickered a fragile ember of belief. Rex barked once more, turning toward the northern wall. His whole body pointed, demanding they see. Laura followed his gaze. Beyond that wall lay the ridge, the direction the radio signal seemed to echo from. The same path the blood-marked intruders likely patrolled. But if Rex was right, if Ethan's instincts weren't illusion, then maybe, just maybe, that signal wasn't only a threat. Maybe it was a breadcrumb, a weakness. Laura exhaled shakily, realization dawning. They're not just talking to each other, she murmured. They're leaving a trail. And if we can follow it, we'll know where they're hiding. Ethan looked up, hope trembling on his lips. Then we can stop them. Her heart twisted. She didn't want him to carry such weight. Yet in this chaos, she saw something vital. Ethan's fear was not breaking him. It was forging him. She cupped his cheek. We don't stop them. Not alone. But we can outsmart them. And that starts by listening. She turned back to the radio, adjusting the knobs. Each crackle, each fragment, every distorted syllable became another piece of the puzzle. And in that moment, she realized her role was no longer just survival. She had to translate between noise and meaning, between Ethan's fragile certainty and Rex's primal instincts. She became the interpreter. The bridge. Outside, the storm raged. The predators waited. But inside, amidst static and fear, a bond crystallized. Laura drew Ethan close, her hand resting on Rex's fur, their small circle of trust against the encroaching dark. And with her voice firm, defiant, she whispered into the roar of static and snow. We listen, we decode, we endure. Together. The radio crackled again, spilling fragments of secrets that could decide their fate. And for the first time that night, Laura did not feel only hunted. She felt equipped. The game was no longer one-sided. It had just become theirs to play. The storm had grown monstrous, as if nature itself conspired with the men who hunted them. Snow lashed against the walls of the cabin in relentless sheets, a white curtain that blurred the world beyond. The wind screamed through cracks in the wood, carrying with it a deep chill that gnawed at bone and nerve alike. Inside, the air was heavy with tension, every second drawn taut like a wire ready to snap. Laura could hear her own breathing, shallow and uneven, mixing with Ethan's quickened gasps. The boy clung to Rex, his fingers buried deep into the shepherd's thick fur, his wide eyes darting toward the window, as if expecting a nightmare to manifest there. Rex remained still, but every muscle in the dog's body trembled with suppressed energy. His ears pricked, his lips curled ever so slightly, revealing a glint of white fang. He knew what was coming before any human could. Then came the first flicker outside. Faint beams of light pierced through the curtain of snow. Flashlights. At first one, then two, then half a dozen more. They swayed and bobbed in the tree line like predatory eyes circling their prey. Daniel moved before anyone else. His body, though battered and bleeding, straightened with a swiftness that seemed impossible. He reached for the pistol on the table, his hand steady, his jaw clenched. In that instant, Laura saw a transformation, no longer the half-conscious wounded man she had tended to in the hospital, but something else. Something honed and lethal. A man who had lived years inside the shadow of violence. A man whose calm could kill. "Stay low," he hissed, his voice stripped of warmth, pure command. Laura pulled Ethan down behind the overturned couch, shielding his body with her own. The boy whimpered, and Laura whispered into his hair, words she didn't believe herself. "It'll be okay. It'll be okay." But outside, the crunch of boots on snow drew closer, and the beams of light widened, converging on the cabin like jaws. Then, without warning, the glass shattered. The explosion of sound ripped through the room, shards flying like tiny blades across the floorboards. A black-gloved hand had hurled something, a crowbar maybe, through the pane, opening the cabin to the storm. The cold knifed into the room, and with it came chaos. Rex launched first. With a guttural snarl, he bounded through the broken frame, a streak of muscle and fury. Laura screamed his name, but it was too late. He was already on the intruder, knocking him flat into the snow. The man's shout was cut short by the crushing impact of jaws on flesh. Rex Ethan cried, tears streaming as he tried to scramble after his dog. Laura held him back, arms locked around the boy's trembling body, whispering desperately, "No, stay here, stay with me." Gunfire erupted. Daniel moved like a storm inside the storm. His pistol cracked thunder into the night, each shot precise, controlled, deliberate. A man staggered back into the trees. Another fell screaming into the snow, his flashlight spinning wild beams across the whiteness. Daniel's face was ice, his focus absolute. He didn't look like a man fighting to survive. He looked like a man reclaiming his element. Laura could barely process what she was seeing. The man who had whispered fears of death into her hands hours ago now cut through the dark like a blade, every move sharpened by training that no ordinary life could explain. For a heartbeat, she forgot her own fear and simply stared, transfixed by the revelation. This was Daniel Hayes, the FBI agent, the fugitive, the man who had carried secrets too dark to bear. But there were too many of them. From the corner of the cabin, another window shattered. A figure ducked inside, rifle raised. Laura's breath caught, her body reacted before her mind did. She hurled the nearest object, a heavy lantern, at the man. It cracked against his shoulder, knocking the rifle sideways just as he fired. The bullet tore splinters from the wall instead of finding a skull. Daniel pivoted instantly. 2 shots rang quick and merciless. The man crumpled halfway through the window, his body wedged grotesquely between inside and out. Blood smeared across the frame, bright even against the snowstorm beyond. Good, Daniel muttered almost to himself. Good instincts. Laura couldn't tell if it was praise or simply acknowledgement, but the words burned into her all the same. She pressed Ethan closer, her hands shaking, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might split her chest. Outside, Rex yelped a sharp guttural sound that cleaved through the storm. Ethan's scream followed. Rex, his little body thrashed against Laura's arms, desperate to reach the dog. Laura dared to glance through the shattered window. In the swirl of white, she caught the sight of Rex locked onto a man's arm, dragging him down into the snow. Another shadow loomed behind, raising something metallic. Bang! The second man collapsed into silence. Rex tore free and leapt aside, snow spraying around him. Daniel lowered his smoking pistol eyes, already searching for the next target. But the lights outside didn't fade. More beams appeared, closing in tighter, encircling the cabin from every angle. Dozens, maybe more. The storm couldn't hide them now. The hunters had multiplied, the noose drawn tight. Daniel reloaded, the click of the magazine loud in the silence between gunfire. His movements were efficient, mechanical, the rhythm of a man who had done this too many times. His jaw was set, his eyes unreadable. Laura forced her voice steady, though terror scraped every word. How many are there? Daniel didn't look at her. Enough. His answer was a wall. No comfort, no explanation, just the truth. Laura swallowed hard, heat rising in her throat. She wanted to scream at him for dragging this nightmare into her town, for putting Ethan in this hell, for putting her here. But there was no time and no point. The storm outside was filled with enemies, and inside the only thing keeping them alive was the cold, ruthless man crouched by the window. For a long stretch, the world was nothing but the howl of wind, the flicker of flashlights, and the echo of boots shifting in snow. They were waiting, testing, letting fear bleed them dry before the next strike. It was psychological warfare, and Laura knew it. She had seen it in patients' eyes, the erosion of hope, the slow collapse under pressure. Only this time she was the patient. Ethan whimpered again, his small voice cracking. They're going to take me. Laura kissed the top of his head fiercely, as if her lips alone could shield him. No, she whispered. Not while I'm here. Not while Daniel's here. But deep inside, she wasn't sure if she believed herself. Then suddenly silence broke. A crash against the far wall, the groan of splintering wood. The back door shook violently under a heavy impact. They were trying to breach from multiple sides now. Daniel spun, signaling Laura without words move. She dragged Ethan across the room, behind the heavy wooden table, just as the door rattled again, louder, harder. Snowflakes spilled in through the gaps, carried on the furious wind. Daniel crouched low, gun aimed steady. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He was the calm in the storm, the deadliest kind of calm. The door cracked. Wood splintered. Another shove and it would give way. Laura's nails dug into Ethan's arm as she pulled him closer, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. The siege was only beginning. The cabin walls quivered from the pounding against the back door. Each slam sent a vibration through the floorboards, rattling dishes and making the oil lamp on the table flicker dangerously. Daniel crouched low, weapon aimed at the failing wood eyes, unblinking. His body was taut, ready, as if his entire being lived only in the seconds between sound and silence. Laura clutched Ethan against her chest, her body curved protectively over his trembling form. She felt his heart hammering through his ribs, wild and panicked like a trapped bird. His sobs came in ragged bursts, muffled into her sweater. She whispered soothing words that dissolved before they left her lips, drowned by the storm and the battering outside. Then the door gave way. With a deafening crack, the back entrance exploded, inward snow and splinters swirling into the room. Figures surged through the breach, dark, heavy, faceless under masks and goggles. Daniel fired immediately, the pistol barking thunder into the chaos. One intruder spun back, clutching his chest, collapsing in the doorway. Another stumbled, but pushed forward, relentless. Laura ducked lower, shielding Ethan as wood fragments sprayed around them. Rex growled ferociously, his body thrashing against her grip, desperate to launch at the enemy. She wanted to release him, wanted the dog's fury unleashed, but terror of losing him, the way she'd almost lost Daniel, clenched her fists tighter. Daniel fought with precision, every shot purposeful. But the tide was too strong. More men poured through windows, through the front, circling like wolves closing in on a stag. The storm outside masked their numbers until they were already inside. "Laura down," Daniel barked. She dropped her head just as a burst of gunfire tore across the room, splintering the table into jagged fragments. The lamp shattered, plunging the cabin into near darkness. The only light came from the storm itself, the pale cold glow of snow funneling through broken windows. Shadows flickered like demons across the walls. Daniel pivoted, firing into the storm-lit silhouettes. Another man screamed, fell. But in his focus, in the relentless rhythm of his defense, he missed the movement at his flank. From the side window, a figure lunged. The intruder didn't shoot. Instead, he crashed into Daniel, bodily tackling him with brutal force. The pistol skittered across the floor, spinning into the corner. Daniel's grunt was sharp wind knocked from his lungs. He slammed an elbow into the attacker's ribs, a savage counter. But another figure seized his arm, wrenching it behind his back. "Daniel." Laura screamed, half rising, before instinct yanked her back down to cover Ethan. Her cry was swallowed by the storm and the chaos. But her eyes locked on his. Just for a second, their gazes met across the room. His face was set hard, but in his eyes flickered something unspoken, something desperate. Then they pulled him. The men moved with military coordination, dragging Daniel toward the shattered back door. He fought like an animal, kicking, twisting. But there were too many. A strike to his temple staggered him. Blood streamed down the side of his face, glistening against the snow swirling through the doorway. "No." Laura's voice tore raw from her throat. She surged forward before fear froze her legs. Ethan's scream pierced behind her. "Don't take him. Don't take Daniel." Rex went wild. The shepherd lunged, claws scraping the wooden floor, teeth gnashing. He hurled himself toward the men, dragging Daniel. One attacker cursed as Rex's jaws snapped inches from his thigh. Another kicked, sending the dog sprawling back with a yelp that ripped through Ethan's heart like a blade. Ethan sobbed, scrambling forward, but Laura grabbed him, pulling him back with strength she didn't know she possessed. Her arms were iron, her body shielding him as the world collapsed around them. In the doorway, Daniel's voice roared, hoarse, defiant. "Laura, protect them." The next blow silenced him. They wrenched him into the storm, his body vanishing into the white blur swallowed by the blizzard, as if the night itself had devoured him. The lights of flashlights bobbed, retreating deeper into the trees, until only shadows and swirling snow remained. Then there was nothing. The silence that followed was unbearable. The attackers who remained retreated swiftly, covering their extraction, firing a few wild shots that shattered shelves and sent books raining to the floor. Then they were gone too, swallowed by the storm, leaving only destruction behind. Laura stood frozen, Ethan clutching her so tightly it hurt. Her ears rang from gunfire, her chest burned with the weight of panic, disbelief, grief. Her body trembled as though she had been the one struck. Daniel was gone. Ethan broke first. His small body collapsed into sobs so violent they shook his frame. He buried his face into her sweater, his cries muffled but piercing. "They took him. They took him." His voice broke again and again, until it was only sound, raw pain spilling into the ruined cabin. Laura dropped to her knees, pulling him fully into her arms. Her own tears blurred her vision, but she forced herself not to fall apart. She wanted to scream, to rage, to shatter like the glass littering the floor. But she couldn't. She had to be more than herself now. She rocked Ethan against her, whispering through clenched teeth, I know, baby. But we're still here. We're still alive. I won't let them take you too." Rex staggered to the door claws, scraping the wood as he scratched furiously against it, desperate to follow. His body trembled, his cries sharp, mournful, guttural. He threw his head back and howled into the storm, a sound of grief and fury that seemed to shake the very air. The boy lifted his tear-streaked face, eyes glistening with broken hope. "He'll die, won't he? They're going to kill him." Laura gripped his face between her trembling hands, forcing his gaze into hers. No. Listen to me, Ethan. Daniel's alive. They didn't kill him here because they need him. And if he's alive, we have a chance. Do you hear me? We still have a chance. Her own voice threatened to crack, but she bit down hard, steadying herself. She had to be iron unbreakable because if she crumbled, the boy would shatter completely. She glanced at Rex, whose howl had turned into a low, restless growl. His body pressed against the broken frame, his instincts urging him forward out into the storm to hunt, to fight. And in that moment, something hardened inside Laura. She wasn't trained. She wasn't a fighter. She was a doctor who had spent her life saving lives with gentle hands, not taking them with guns. But she understood responsibility. She understood duty. And now Daniel's last command echoed in her chest like a drum. Protect them. She rose slowly, Ethan still clinging to her side. Her body ached, her mind reeled, but clarity burned through the fog of fear. Daniel had fought to keep them alive, and now he was gone. That meant the responsibility, the burden, the fight was hers. She looked down at Ethan, brushing the hair from his damp forehead. I'm not going to let them hurt you. Do you understand? You're safe with me. The boy sniffled, his voice a whisper broken by tears. But who's going to save Daniel? Laura's throat tightened, but she held his gaze with fire she didn't know she had. We are. The words surprised her as much as him. But once spoken, they took root. She felt them solidify in her chest, heavier than fear, stronger than doubt. We are. Rex turned ears-pricked eyes burning with something primal, as though he understood every word. He let out a low, guttural bark affirmation, promise demand. Laura nodded at the dog, her decision carved in stone. The storm roared outside, rattling what remained of the shattered cabin. But inside her, a new storm brewed fiercer than the blizzard. She was terrified, yes. But she would not let terror define her. Daniel had been taken. Ethan was still here. That was enough to fight for, enough to survive for, enough to transform her into something she had never been. Laura Grace, the quiet doctor, the woman who had once lived only for duty to her patients, now carried a different duty. The lives of a child and a man hung in balance. She would not let them fall. She pulled Ethan close again, whispering into his hair with a voice steady as steel. We're going to find him. We're going to bring him back, no matter what it takes. Ethan's arms tightened around her. Rex pressed his weight against her leg, as if swearing loyalty. The night stretched before them, filled with snow and shadows filled with danger beyond measure. But for the first time, Laura did not feel like prey. She felt like the beginning of the fight. The silence after Daniel's abduction hung in the air, like an invisible weight pressing down on every surface of the old wooden cabin. The storm outside screamed against the fragile walls, but inside it was the absence of his presence that hollowed the room. Laura stood frozen in place, her pulse racing, her mind replaying those final chaotic seconds, Daniel being yanked into the blinding curtain of snow, his muffled shout lost to the wind. It had been too fast, too sudden. One mistake, one breath too slow, and now he was gone. Ethan sobbed against her side, his small hands clawing at her coat, desperate for reassurance she didn't feel capable of giving. His tears soaked through the wool, warm and heavy, but they were the least of her concerns. Rex, the German shepherd, paced near the broken doorframe, growling in guttural bursts, his body taut with restless fury. He wanted to bolt into the night, to track, to tear through the enemy ranks, and drag Daniel back by sheer force of will. But Laura pressed a trembling hand to the dog's thick fur. Not yet, she whispered, her voice shaking but firm. Not without a plan. She didn't know who she was speaking to, Rex the boy or herself. Perhaps all three. The cabin felt emptier without Daniel's quiet authority. He had been the one who understood the scope of the danger, who had anticipated moves and counter-moves like a grandmaster at a chessboard. Laura had only followed his lead, unsure but committed. Now the board had flipped, and she was left staring at pieces she didn't know how to move. But as her eyes swept across the dim interior, her attention snagged on Daniel's backpack, half buried beneath a heap of blankets and medical supplies. The strap was torn, one buckle broken. He must have dropped it in the struggle or left it behind deliberately. Laura's breath caught. Her hands moved before her doubt could stop them. She dragged the bag closer, ignoring Ethan's soft whimper of confusion. Zippers rasped under her shaking grip. Inside were scraps of survival gear, ammunition, half a first aid kit, a flashlight with fading batteries. And then her fingers closed on something solid, cold, and metallic. A portable hard drive. Laura pulled it out slowly, staring at the matte casing as though it were an alien artifact. Its weight felt disproportionate to its size, as if it carried the density of a buried world. She knew instantly what it was. Daniel had spoken of it, hinted at its gravity proof of Ward's empire, the reason they were all hunted. Her thumb traced the scratches across its surface. This little block of metal was why Daniel's life was now in jeopardy. Why Ethan was a target. Why the cabin itself felt like a coffin waiting to collapse. Ethan's small voice cracked through the suffocating silence. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, eyes puffy and red. What is it? She crouched to his level, holding the drive up between them. This is what your dad risked everything for. Inside are files, pictures, maybe even videos. Proof of what the bad man Ward has been doing. She hesitated, swallowing hard. It's dangerous, Ethan. But it's also powerful. With this, we might be able to stop him. The boy blinked wide-eyed, his gaze darting between her and the object in her hand. His lip trembled, but instead of collapsing further into fear, he straightened, nodding with surprising seriousness. Then we have to keep it safe. Something inside Laura shifted at that moment. His faith in her raw, unfiltered, undeserved, lit a spark against the crushing dark. She had been a nurse trained to patch wounds and hold hands through pain, but never to stand between a child and the jaws of organized evil. Yet here she was. Ethan reached out, curling his fingers around hers where she held the drive. You're my hero now. Until Daddy comes back. The words hit her like a blade, sharp, unrelenting. But instead of cutting her down, they carved something stronger out of the chaos inside her. Hero. Temporary or not, she would have to earn that title. She pulled Ethan into her arms, holding him tight, and whispered into his hair. I won't let anything happen to you. I promise. Rex's low growl brought her back to the present. The dog was crouched near the window, ears, pricked muscles, coiled. His gaze wasn't on her, but outside toward the storm-lashed trees. Laura followed his stare and saw faint flickers of light flashlights moving in the distance, probing the dark like predatory eyes. The enemy was still out there, watching, waiting. Laura's grip on the hard drive tightened. It wasn't just a burden anymore. It was leverage. And if she played it right, it could be a weapon. She scanned the room, searching for something, anything, to turn the odds in their favor. The cabin was little more than rotting timber and rusting nails. But Daniel's gear offered small advantages, a handful of bullets, a dull hunting knife, a half-broken radio. It wasn't much, but survival had never been about abundance. It was about will, her will. She sat Ethan down, gently brushing snow from his hair. I need you to be brave a little longer, she said, meeting his eyes with steady determination. Can you do that for me? Ethan sniffled but nodded. I'll try. Good. Rex and I will keep watch. You stay close, stay quiet. As if understanding his role, Rex padded to her side, pressing his weight against her leg. His steady presence anchored her, his loyalty unwavering. He had been Daniel's protector, Ethan's guardian. Now he was hers too. Laura slipped the hard drive into her coat right over her heart, as though it could fuse with her resolve. She felt its edges dig into her ribs with every breath, a constant reminder of the cost of failure. The minutes stretched into tense eternity. The storm outside didn't relent, but its howling became background to her racing thoughts. What would Daniel do? He would calculate, anticipate, control. She wasn't Daniel. But she had something else, a nurse's instinct to protect life, to push through fear because someone depended on her. That was its own kind of strength. And slowly she realized strength wasn't always the absence of fear. Sometimes it was the decision to move despite it. The cabin creaked as the wind battered its sides. Shadows from the flashlight beams outside crawled along the frosted windows, ghost-like and sinister. Laura forced her breathing steady, clutching the knife in one hand, the flashlight in the other. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't trained for war. But tonight she was all Ethan had, and she would not break. The boy's soft whisper floated across the room. Laura, yes, I think Dad knew you'd protect me. That's why he said it. Her throat tightened, but she didn't let the emotion break her. She smiled faintly, though her eyes burned. Then, let's make sure we don't prove him wrong. Rex's bark shattered the fragile moment. Not a warning this time, but a sharp, urgent call. Laura snapped her head toward the window. The lights outside were closer now, too close. They were circling. The siege wasn't over. It was tightening. Laura crouched beside Ethan, gripping his shoulders firmly. Listen to me. Whatever happens, stay with Rex. He'll keep you safe if I can't. The boy's eyes glistened with terror. But what about you? She squeezed his hand, forcing steel into her voice. I'll be right behind you, always. Even as she said it, she knew promises were fragile in nights like these. But sometimes hope was all a child had to cling to. Laura rose, planting herself between the door and the trembling boy. The hard drive pressed like a brand against her chest. She wasn't just holding evidence anymore. She was holding the line. And in that frozen heartbeat, as the storm roared and enemies prowled outside, she discovered the truth Daniel had always carried but never spoken aloud. Courage wasn't about never falling. It was about standing back up with blood in your mouth and defiance in your eyes. For Ethan, for Daniel, for herself. Laura Bennett, the nurse, who had once doubted her place in this nightmare, now understood she was not just surviving. She was fighting, and the battle was only beginning. The snowstorm raged like a living beast thrashing against the broken shingles of the old cabin. The walls groaned with each gust as if they could splinter and collapse at any second. Inside, the air was tense, thick with the unspoken fear that clung to every breath. Laura stood at the table, her hands trembling above the cracked wooden surface. Before her lay the scattered contents of Daniel's pack, the hard drive, loose papers, a small radio with a cracked antenna, and a handgun that felt too heavy for her untrained grip. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to steady. Daniel was gone, dragged into the white abyss, and if she hesitated now, Ethan would be next. The boy sat curled near the fire, his small frame hunched against Rex's side. His eyes, red from crying, lifted toward Laura with something both fragile and fierce trust. We're not waiting anymore, she whispered, almost to herself. Ethan blinked, uncertain. What do you mean? Laura's gaze drifted toward the radio, its battered casing reflecting the orange glow of the flames. An idea had been forming ever since she'd found the old cassette tapes Daniel carried, recordings of Ward's voice-clipped segments of the Kingpin, boasting orders and threats. Daniel had kept them as evidence. To Laura, they were something else, a weapon. They think they have the upper hand, she said, crouching down, so Ethan could see the resolve hardening in her expression. But we're going to make them doubt each other. We're going to use their own leader's voice against them. Ethan's brow furrowed. His small hands gripped the edge of Rex's fur. You mean trick them? Yes, Laura replied. Exactly that. Rex shifted, ears perked as if sensing the weight of her words. The dog moved closer to the table, nostrils flaring, as though he already understood the next step. Laura powered on the radio, the static shrieking loud enough to rattle her teeth. She winced quickly, adjusting the dials, until the sound settled into a steady hiss. Then she inserted the tape. The machine whirred, the cassette clicking into motion. Ward's gravelly voice bled out through the static. If anyone betrays me, you know the price. Blood. There are no second chances. The sound filled the cabin, heavy and menacing. Ethan flinched, but didn't look away. Laura met his eyes. We'll broadcast this, make them think Ward is calling them out. If they start to fear betrayal inside their ranks, they'll turn on each other long enough for us to move. It was reckless, insane, but it was also the only chance they had. Ethan nodded, surprisingly firm. Okay, tell me what to do. Laura's chest tightened at his courage. This boy, fragile yet unyielding, reminded her of the children she used to protect in the hospital wards, kids who had fought for every breath but refused to let go. Ethan was like that, a survivor. Together they worked quickly. Laura spliced sections of Ward's recorded threats, cutting and rewinding, forming a loop that sounded authentic enough to pass for a live command. Ethan, nimble with small fingers, handled the dials, setting the frequency to the band Daniel had said Ward's men used. When they were ready, Laura pressed the switch. The radio crackled, then burst alive. Ward's distorted voice cutting through the storm. "There's a traitor among you. I know it. Prove your loyalty. Root them out or die in the snow." For a moment, silence stretched, broken only by the roar of wind outside. Then an answering signal, faint but real. Male voices shouting over static. Confusion. Arguments. "It's working," Ethan whispered, his eyes wide. Laura swallowed hard, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Now we move." Rex barked once, sharp and commanding, as if confirming the order. The dog paced to the door, muscles coiled, waiting. Laura strapped Daniel's handgun at her side, its weight both foreign and necessary. She slung the hard drive into her backpack. Then she helped Ethan into his coat, double knotting the scarf around his neck. Every movement felt urgent, but she forced herself to remain calm. Panic would only make mistakes. When they stepped outside, the storm nearly shoved them back. Snow pelted their faces, slicing like shards of glass. The world beyond the cabin was a blur of white, broken only by the dim glow of lanterns in the distance. Shadows moved there, men with guns circling, searching. "Stay close to me," Laura said, gripping Ethan's hand tightly. Rex pressed against her leg, then surged forward into the storm nose, low to the ground. The dog became their compass, weaving through drifts, guiding them by instinct. Every step was agony. The snow clawed at their legs, the wind hollowed their chests. But they pushed forward, fueled by something stronger than fear, purpose. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then movement ahead. Through the haze of snow, Laura saw the faint outline of a structure. Not a house, not a cabin, something rougher. A shed, perhaps. A place where men would stash a prisoner. Daniel. Her heart lurched, but the risk sharpened too. Figures patrolled the perimeter, their flashlights slicing through the storm like blades. Laura crouched low, pulling Ethan against her. They couldn't rush this. One mistake, and it was over. Rex growled softly, his body taut. The dog's eyes fixed on a gap in the patrol, a blind spot where the guards overlapped imperfectly. Laura's pulse hammered in her ears. She leaned close to Ethan. "When I tell you, follow Rex. Stay low, don't stop no matter what." Ethan's breath shuddered, but he nodded. "I trust you." That trust was a weight heavier than any weapon. She couldn't fail him. She waited, timing the guards' movements, the sweep of the lights. When the moment came, she whispered, "Now." Rex shot forward, cutting through the snow with predatory precision. Ethan scrambled after him, small body almost swallowed by the drifts. Laura followed, every nerve screaming, as they darted across the exposed ground. A shout cut through the wind. One of the guards had seen them. Gunfire erupted, sharp cracks muffled by the storm. Snow exploded beside Laura, spraying her face with icy shrapnel. She shoved Ethan ahead, shielding him with her body as they dove into the shadow of the shed. Her lungs burned, but they were alive, for now. Inside the shed's warped wood, muffled voices echoed. Daniel's. Rough, strained, but alive. "Move!" Laura hissed, pushing Ethan inside first. The darkness swallowed them whole, the air thick with damp rot. And there, bound to a chair, blood streaking his temple, was Daniel. His eyes widened. Laura. Relief surged through her, but there was no time. The guards outside were shouting, closing in. Laura rushed forward, fumbling with the ropes around Daniel's wrists. "We don't have long." Daniel gritted his teeth, his voice low and urgent. "You shouldn't be here. They'll kill you." "We came for you," Laura snapped, tugging harder at the knots. "We're not leaving without you." Ethan clung to Rex, who growled softly, guarding the door. The boy's eyes glistened with determination. "She's right. We can do this." The ropes gave way, Daniel stumbling free. He looked at Laura, something raw and unspoken passing between them. Respect, disbelief, gratitude. But the sound outside swelled. Boots crunching in snow, weapons cocking. Laura's chest heaved. The plan had bought them a window, but it was closing fast. They would have to fight their way out. Daniel grabbed the handgun from her side, checking the magazine with the instinctive ease of a man who had lived in violence too long. He handed her a smaller knife from his boot. "If you're staying in this fight, you'll need this." Her hand closed around the handle, cold, solid. For the first time, she didn't feel like an intruder in Daniel's war. She felt like a soldier. Ethan whispered, voice trembling but steady, "We're ready." The storm howled, drowning the world in white. Outside, the men of Ward's empire circled closer, unaware their prey had just become the hunters. Laura tightened her grip on the knife. Rex lowered into a silent crouch, teeth bared. Daniel chambered around eyes, narrowing with lethal calm. This was no longer about survival alone. This was the beginning of their counterattack. The warehouse smelled of rust, gasoline, and blood. Laura's boots barely made a sound on the splintered wooden floor as she edged forward, heart pounding against her ribs. Through the thin slit of broken boards, she saw Daniel stripped of his jacket wrists, chained high above him, his face swollen with bruises from relentless blows. Around him, shadows moved, men with guns slung casually over their shoulders, laughing as if torture were a casual pastime. Ethan clung to her sleeve, trembling, but his eyes burned with determination. Laura pressed a finger to her lips, then looked at Rex. The dog crouched low, muscles coiled like springs, his teeth bared in silence. The moment snapped open, like glass shattering. One guard turned his back toward the entrance, and Laura didn't hesitate. She raised Daniel's pistol, felt the cold steel weight in her palm, and fired. The shot cracked through the warehouse. The man dropped instantly. Chaos erupted. Rex lunged forward with a savage snarl, colliding into another guard and dragging him down, his jaws crushing bone. Laura rushed inside, grabbing Ethan's shoulder, shoving him toward the chains. "Go! Get him out!" she screamed. Bullets ricocheted against metal beams. Sparks lit the dark like lightning. Daniel, barely conscious, raised his head when he felt Ethan's small hands fumbling with the lock on his shackles. "Ethan?" His voice was broken raw. The boy shook his head fiercely. "No talking, Dad. Just hold on." Then Malcolm Ward stepped into the open. His presence cut the air colder than the storm outside. Tall, dressed in a dark trench coat, his face was a mask of ice. His gun hung steady in his grip as he surveyed the chaos. So he said, his tone calm, even mocking. The runaway agent, the widow, and the child. A pathetic little family reunion. Laura aimed at him, hands trembling but eyes unblinking. "Let him go, Ward." Ward smirked. "You pointing a gun at me. Do you even understand who I am?" "I don't care who you are," Laura hissed. "Tonight you bleed." He moved faster than she expected. The first shot grazed her arm, a searing burn that made her stagger back, but she didn't lower her weapon. She fired again, the bullet slicing past Ward's shoulder. His calm broke his eyes, narrowing with a predator's fury. The warehouse became a war zone. Glass shattered, wooden beams splintered under gunfire. Daniel, finally freed by Ethan's trembling hands, staggered forward, blood running down his temple. With a roar of defiance, he grabbed a fallen rifle and opened fire, cutting down 2 of Ward's men. Rex fought like a demon, leaping from shadow to shadow, dragging attackers into the dark corners, the sound of tearing cloth and screams puncturing the roar of gunfire. But Ward was relentless. He closed in on Laura, each step deliberate, his shots forcing her backward toward a pile of crates. She stumbled, dropped behind cover, reloading with shaking fingers. Daniel tried to intercept, but Ward's bullet tore into his side. He crumpled with a groan, clutching the wound. "Daniel!" Laura screamed. Her voice cracked, but her spirit did not. She rose from behind the crates and fired again, hitting Ward's thigh. He faltered but didn't fall. Instead, he charged her, slamming the gun from her hands with brutal force. They collided, crashing into crates, fists in fury. Ward's strength was monstrous, but Laura fought with something deeper than rage. She fought with desperation, with love, with the raw will of a mother protecting a child. She clawed, struck, and kicked, refusing to yield, even as pain blinded her. Daniel, bleeding out, dragged himself toward them. "Laura, don't stop." His voice was ragged but fierce. Ward struck her across the face, the blow splitting her lip. She fell to her knees, gasping for air, but she reached blindly for a shard of glass on the ground. As Ward raised his weapon to finish her, Rex came out of nowhere, slamming into him with a thunderous growl. Teeth sank deep into Ward's arm, the gun clattering to the ground. Laura seized her chance. With every ounce of strength left, she drove the shard into Ward's shoulder. His scream echoed across the rafters. Ethan, still clutching the broken shackles, scrambled forward and kicked the gun toward Daniel. With trembling hands, Daniel raised the weapon. Blood dripped from his side, his vision fading, but his aim locked onto Ward's chest. "Enough," Daniel growled. His finger tightened on the trigger. Ward froze, his eyes flicking between the broken man aiming at him, the dog tearing at his flesh, and the woman who refused to bow. The gunshot cracked. Ward stumbled back, blood blooming across his coat. For the first time, the mask of invincibility shattered, but it wasn't over. His men still swarmed in the shadows. The fight raged on, bullets flying, chaos roaring. Yet in that storm of violence, something had changed. Laura, Daniel, Ethan, and Rex were no longer prey. They were fire, they were steel, and they were ready to tear down the empire of the man who thought he was untouchable. The snowstorm outside screamed against the broken windows, as if the world itself bore witness to the reckoning. The moment Ward's bloody hand closed around the hard drive, the air inside the warehouse shifted. He had it everything. Laura had risked her life to protect everything Daniel had bled to uncover. The flicker of triumph in Ward's eyes was venomous. His voice cut through the cacophony of groans, gunfire echoes, and the whimper of settling debris. "It's over," he said coldly, raising his gun. His gaze moved from Laura, still half kneeling with blood running from her brow, to Daniel struggling to stay upright, to Ethan clutching his father's arm with terrified eyes. He sneered. "You should have stayed ghosts. Now you die as nothing." The world seemed to constrict around Laura. Her breath came ragged, but her mind spun faster than ever. Ward had the drive, but he didn't know what she had prepared, what Daniel's foresight had built into those encrypted files. She had one final play, one last desperate chance to turn the tide. Her fingers slipped inside her jacket, finding the small satellite transmitter Daniel had insisted she carry. It wasn't much, just a jury-rigged device patched together from military scraps, but it was enough. Enough to send a signal beyond the walls of this hell. Enough to scream the truth to the world. Ward cocked the pistol, the barrel gleaming with cold promise. "Say goodbye, Agent Moore." Laura's thumb hit the switch. A pulse hummed through the air so faint it could almost be mistaken for static. But on the small, cracked tablet propped beside the transmitter, screens began to glow. Daniel's files, videos, photographs, transcripts, maps erupted into life. And then, with the push of a final command, Laura opened the gates. The live stream activated. Ward's smirk faltered as the tablet illuminated his face with damning light. All across the globe, on laptops in crowded apartments, on phones in the hands of journalists, on monitors inside government offices, the evidence poured out. Secret deals, smuggled weapons, torture chambers cataloged in sickening detail. Politicians, generals, corporate giants, names linked to Ward's empire exposed in ruthless clarity. The silence that followed wasn't silence at all. It was the sound of the world, gasping. Ward's jaw tightened. He smashed the tablet with his boot, but the transmission had already soared beyond his reach. "No." His whisper was ragged, primal. "No, no, no." Laura forced herself to stand, her body trembling, but her eyes locked on him. "It's over, Ward. The world is watching now." His mask cracked. Rage tore through his composure. He turned his gun on Ethan, his voice a roar. "Then I'll kill what you love most before they come." Ethan froze, eyes wide, breath sharp. Daniel tried to shield his son with his battered body, but he was too weak to hold himself upright. The shriek of sirens cut through the night. Red and blue lights slashed across the snow outside the shattered windows. Helicopter rotors thundered above, shaking the roof beams. The unmistakable bark of orders echoed, "FBI, drop your weapon. Interpol, stand down." Ward's control unraveled. His empire built in shadows was being dragged into daylight in real time. Yet his eyes burned with refusal. He would not go quietly. With a guttural growl, he bolted toward the side exit, clutching the drive to his chest like a lifeline. Laura lunged to stop him, but her legs gave way. Daniel collapsed beside her, his hand reaching, his voice raw. "Laura, stop him." And then Rex moved. The dog was a streak of muscle and fury, leaping through debris with fangs bared. Ward barely made it 3 steps into the snowstorm before Rex slammed into him from the side, teeth sinking into his arm. Ward shrieked, dropping the pistol into the slush. He fought wildly, punching, kicking, but Rex held fast, dragging him down into the snow. Flashes of tactical lights cut through the storm as agents swarmed the perimeter. Orders shouted. Boots crunched on ice. Ward screamed like a cornered animal trying to wrench free. The hard drive slipped from his grip, landing inches from Rex's paws. Laura staggered into the doorway, Daniel leaning on her shoulder, Ethan clutching her coat. She watched as Ward flailed his empire, crumbling not because of bullets or bombs, but because truth had gutted him in front of the entire world. Rex snarled, holding him pinned until armed agents closed in. And for the first time, Ward's voice broke, not with fury, but with panic. Wait, listen to me, I can explain. I can buy my freedom. I can still fix this. But there was nothing left to fix. The world had already seen. The lies were ashes. Laura tightened her hold on Daniel, whispering fiercely in his ear. We're not his prisoners anymore. Daniel's breath trembled, but there was relief in his eyes. Ethan, small yet unbroken, pressed his face into his father's chest, clinging as if to anchor him to the earth. The warehouse behind them groaned under the weight of the storm. The snow carried away the sound of Ward's screams as agents wrestled him into cuffs. For Laura, there was no triumph in this moment. Only survival. Only the knowledge that the truth had finally broken free. She had made her choice, and it had cost blood, pain, and fear. But it had given the world something priceless, the undeniable face of corruption. Her knees buckled, and Daniel caught her as best he could. Together, bruised, bleeding, but still alive, they faced the storm outside not as prey, but as survivors who had finally stolen power back from the man who had tried to erase them. And through it all, Rex stood over them, his chest heaving, his fur streaked with blood, not theirs, but Ward's. Loyal to the last, the dog lifted his head to the howling night as if claiming victory for them all. That was the moment the world shifted. Snow fell like a curtain across the horizon, muffling the chaos that had just erupted and leaving only the sound of helicopters circling above and agents shouting orders through the wind. Ward was dragged away in restraints. His wrists bound, his face twisted in fury and disbelief. The once untouchable man, the architect of shadows, the puppeteer of governments and killers alike, was now reduced to a prisoner, humiliated in front of the world. Cameras still buzzing from the global live stream Laura had unleashed captured his broken figure. His empire, vast and sprawling, crumbled in real time as countries announced investigations. Allies turned traitor, and hidden partners scrambled to sever ties. Ward wasn't just arrested, he was poisoned by exposure. His name, once whispered with fear, now reeked of disgrace. Every file Laura had released detonated like a truth bomb across the world, exposing officials, generals, and corporations in one sweeping wave. For the first time, the web of corruption wasn't hidden in shadows, but dragged into sunlight, raw and undeniable. Interpol agents shoved Ward toward a transport vehicle. His voice cracked, desperate now, stripped of arrogance. You'll regret this, all of you. I built nations, I made kings. His words vanished beneath the roar of rotor blades swallowed by the blizzard. Laura stood in the snow. Her coat torn, her face streaked with blood and exhaustion, watching as Ward was loaded into the armored van. Daniel leaned heavily on her, his breath shallow, his body weakened by wounds, but his spirit unbroken. Ethan clutched his father's hand with both of his small ones, refusing to let go. And Rex, his fur bristling, stood at their side, like a sentinel, his chest rising and falling, eyes never leaving the chaos until Ward disappeared from sight. It was over, or at least the battle was. But victories in wars like this never came clean. In the weeks that followed, the headlines consumed the world. Ward's global network exposed. Historic trials begin. Collapse of Shadow Syndicate. Countries reeled as arrests spread like wildfire. Names that once sat in marble halls and private jets now graced mugshots and court documents. But amidst the celebration of justice, Laura, Daniel, and Ethan were thrust into the quiet, devastating consequences of survival. Ethan was the first priority. The boy, still trembling from nightmares that ripped him awake in the middle of the night, became the center of protection. International authorities swept him into the Witness Protection Program, shielding him under a new identity, a new school, a new future far from the reach of men like Ward. Laura stood in the sterile briefing room the day the papers were signed. Her hands clenched so tightly they shook. She watched Ethan sit with a caseworker. Rex's head in his lap, and she saw the flicker of hope in his eyes as someone explained that his life, his real life, could finally begin. But for Laura, the moment was carved with pain. She had been his protector, his shield, his guide through darkness. Now she had to let him go, not because she wanted to, but because the world demanded it. Daniel understood too well. He sat across the table from her, his arm bandaged, his face hollow with the weight of choices. He was Ethan's father, and though he had fought to reclaim his son, he knew that safety came at the price of separation. His voice cracked as he whispered to Laura, "They'll take care of him. They'll keep him safe. It's more than I could ever give him, while Ward's reach still lingers." Laura nodded, but tears blurred her vision. "He doesn't need them. He needs you." Daniel looked at his hands scarred and trembling. "He needs a world where men like me don't drag him through hell." He lifted his eyes, locking with hers. "And he'll have that. Because of you." It wasn't fair. Nothing about it was. But survival often wasn't. On the day Ethan was escorted into his new life, Rex padded faithfully beside him. The boy knelt down, pressing his forehead against the dog's muzzle. His small voice, trembling but fierce, carried the weight of a promise. "You're the real hero, Rex. You saved us all." Laura stood in the doorway, her chest aching as she watched Ethan wrap his arms around the animal. She knew the program would allow Rex to stay with him. The bond between them was too strong to sever, and even the most hardened officials couldn't deny that. Seeing Ethan with Rex meant that even though the world was forcing him to change names, homes, and histories, he wouldn't be alone. He'd carry with him a piece of love and loyalty that no amount of darkness could erase. As the car pulled away, Ethan's hand pressed against the glass. Rex's head resting on his lap, Laura felt a piece of her heart fracture. She stayed in the snow long after the car disappeared, the cold biting her skin, the silence pressing in. Daniel stood beside her, and for a moment they leaned into each other, held up by grief and love, intertwined. But their story too couldn't continue the way they wished. Daniel was a marked man. Though Ward's empire was shattered, enemies remained. His testimony would be required for years, his safety uncertain, his life condemned to shadows of trials and protective custody. Laura, tied to her badge and oath, had a duty that stretched beyond one man. She belonged to the truth, to the fight that didn't end with Ward. Their eyes met in the quiet of a hospital room, weeks later, where Daniel was recovering under guard. They didn't need to speak to know what both were thinking. Love had grown between them, not the fleeting, fragile kind, but the kind forged in fire and blood, unshakable and real. Yet love wasn't always enough to conquer the circumstances that crushed them. Laura took his hand, pressing her forehead to his. "We'll carry this with us. Always." His fingers tightened weakly around hers. "I don't know if I'll ever see you again." "You will," she whispered. "In every breath Ethan takes, in every truth we gave the world. That's us. That's forever." When the time came to walk away, the tears they shed weren't loud or desperate. They were quiet, steady rivers that carried pieces of their souls with them. Laura walked out of that room not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Duty demanded it. Survival required it. And love, real love, sometimes meant letting go. Time moved forward as it always does. Ward's trials became spectacles broadcast across every network. His empire's collapse reshaped politics, business, and power structures worldwide. Justice, flawed and imperfect, still burned bright enough to change the course of history. And in the small corners of the world, people whispered the story of those who had dared to bring a tyrant to his knees, not because of armies or wealth, but because of courage. Laura remained in service. Her name erased from public credit, her face absent from headlines, but her legacy etched quietly into the fabric of history. Daniel, hidden and guarded, lived with the scars of battle, but carried the knowledge that his son was free. Ethan, under a new name, grew, with Rex always at his side. His shadow, his protector, his reminder that even in the darkest nights, love could be the fire that never extinguished. And one evening, under the quiet glow of a safe house porch, Ethan whispered again into Rex's ear, his voice soft but certain. "You're the real hero. You showed me monsters can be beaten. Rex's ears flicked, his eyes warm, his breath steady, as if he understood every word. That image, the boy, the dog, the whisper of hope, became the story's final frame. Not Ward's fall, not the pain of parting, but the resilience of innocence, the quiet triumph of love over fear. Because justice isn't born only in courtrooms or prisons. True justice lives in the courage of those willing to face evil head-on, even when the cost is unbearable. Laura, Daniel, Ethan, and Rex had proved it. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply surviving together long enough to let the truth shine. And when the world remembers, it won't remember Ward's screams or his empire's ashes. It will remember a boy holding his dog close, whispering words that carried the weight of survival and healing hero.